The storm rolled in fast, wind whipping against the windows of Caleb's car as he sat frozen in the driver's seat. His phone buzzed again, the screen lighting up with his mother's name. He already knew what she wanted. He had ignored the first 3 calls, but now guilt pressed down on him like a heavy weight. "Caleb, it's Uncle Roger," her voice trembled in the voicemail. "He's in the hospital. He has no one else." A bitter chuckle escaped his lips. No one else. The man who had spent years mocking him, telling the family he was an embarrassment, now needed his help? The same uncle who refused to speak to him after he came out? The hospital loomed ahead, its red emergency sign glowing through the rain. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. "We don't turn our backs on family." Caleb gripped the steering wheel. He could drive away, pretend he never got the message. Or he could step inside and face the man who had once wished he didn't exist. Caleb Mitchell never expected to be back in Redwood Falls, the small Ohio town he had spent most of his life trying to forget. He had left at 18, chasing a life where he didn't have to hide, where he didn't have to lower his voice or change the way he walked just to avoid another comment from his family. In Chicago, he had built a career, found real friends, and, for the first time, felt like he belonged. But now, at 27, he was back. The town hadn't changed much. The same brick storefronts lined Main Street, the same rusted Mitchell's Auto Repair sign hung over his father's shop. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and rain, a scent that used to remind him of home but now felt suffocating. Caleb's mother, Donna, had called him a week ago, voice thick with worry. "Just for a little while," she had pleaded. "Your dad's back is acting up, and the shop needs extra hands." He had sighed, staring at the Chicago skyline outside his apartment window. "Mom, I haven't worked on cars since high school. You don't have to fix anything. Just help out, be here for a bit." A pause. "I miss you, baby." That had done it. So now he was here, standing in the garage where he had spent summers sweating under hoods of old Chevys, his father barking instructions he could never quite follow. His dad, Russell, hadn't said much since Caleb arrived. They weren't openly hostile, just stiff, like 2 strangers forced into a room together. His younger sister, Hannah, had been more welcoming, dragging him to the diner for milkshakes like they were kids again. But no one had mentioned Uncle Roger. Not until today. Roger Mitchell had been a pillar of the town, a man who coached Little League, fixed fences for neighbors, and led Sunday prayers at church. He was also the man who, when Caleb was 16, had told him he would rather have no nephew at all than a broken one. That was the last real conversation they had. And now? Now Roger was in a hospital bed, weak and alone, needing help from the same nephew he had once disowned. Caleb exhaled, staring at the rain streaking against his car window. He could still turn around, tell his mother he wasn't that forgiving. But something about the way she had said, "He has no one else," made him pause. Because whether he liked it or not, this town, this family, it was still a part of him. And for better or worse, he had come back. The hospital smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee. Caleb hated it already. He had spent the last 10 minutes in the parking lot, debating whether to walk inside. Uncle Roger probably didn't even want to see him. But his mother's words kept playing in his head. He has no one else. With a deep breath, he pushed open the glass doors. The waiting room was nearly empty, except for an old TV playing a muted news broadcast. A nurse at the front desk glanced up, offering a polite but tired smile. "I'm here for Roger Mitchell," Caleb said, surprised at how dry his throat felt. She checked her chart. "Room 214, second floor. Family." He hesitated. "Something like that." The elevator ride was slow, each ding tightening the knot in his stomach. When he reached the hallway, he spotted his mother sitting outside Roger's room, hands clasped in her lap. She looked up, relief washing over her face. "You came," she whispered, standing to hug him. Caleb stiffened but let her. "Yeah." "What happened?" She sighed. "Heart failure. It was bad, Caleb. He almost didn't make it." He folded his arms, jaw clenched. "And now he suddenly needs me?" Donna flinched. "He doesn't know you're here yet." "Great. Maybe I should leave before he finds out." "Caleb," she scolded softly. "Please. Just see him. That's all I ask." He stared at the door, at the name Roger Mitchell on the small plaque beneath the room number. The last time they had spoken, Roger's voice had been full of disgust. "People like you ruin families, Caleb." And now, that same man was lying in a hospital bed, vulnerable and alone. Before he could talk himself out of it, he pushed the door open. The room was dim, the only light coming from a beeping heart monitor. Roger looked smaller than Caleb remembered. His broad shoulders now seemed frail, his once sharp eyes dull and sunken. He was asleep, his breathing slow and uneven. Caleb stared at him, expecting to feel satisfaction, maybe even justice. Instead, all he felt was a strange, hollow sadness. The man who had once towered over him, who had made him feel so small, now looked like nothing more than a tired, broken old man. A groggy voice broke the silence. "Who's there?" Caleb inhaled sharply. Roger's eyes fluttered open, blinking in confusion. Then, his gaze landed on Caleb. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Roger's face hardened. "You?" His voice was raspy but laced with something Caleb knew all too well, resentment. And just like that, the past came crashing back. Caleb exhaled slowly, bracing himself. He had expected anger, maybe even denial, but seeing Roger's expression shift from confusion to resentment still hit like a punch to the gut. "You don't look happy to see me," Caleb muttered, stepping closer to the foot of the bed. Roger's jaw tightened, his tired eyes flickering with something unreadable. "Didn't think you'd show up." "Neither did I." A tense silence settled between them. The beeping of the heart monitor filled the room, the sound stretching out the moment longer than it needed to be. Caleb turned to leave, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He had done what his mother asked. He had shown up. That was enough. But just as his fingers brushed the door handle, Roger's voice, hoarse and reluctant, stopped him. "Wait." Caleb hesitated. "Your mother told you?" Roger asked, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. "Yeah," Caleb said, turning back. "Heart failure." Roger's lips pressed into a thin line. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words weren't coming easily. Finally, after a long pause, he swallowed. "They say I need help at home for a while," he admitted. "Rehab, physical therapy. I can't do much on my own." Caleb nodded, his face unreadable. He knew where this was going. He had seen this dynamic before. Family helping family. The problem was, Roger had never treated him like family. "And you want me to help?" Caleb asked, crossing his arms. Roger let out a slow breath, avoiding his gaze. "I don't expect you to want to. I just—" He struggled, shifting uncomfortably against the pillows. "Donna says you're in town." Caleb let out a bitter laugh. "So that's it. After everything, you're asking for my help because I happen to be here." Roger didn't answer. For a second, Caleb wanted to say no, to walk out and let Roger figure it out on his own. Maybe that would be fair. Maybe that's what he deserved. But deep down, beneath the years of anger, there was something else, something he didn't want to admit. He didn't want to be like Roger. "Fine," Caleb said, his voice even. "I'll help. But don't expect us to pretend nothing happened." Roger gave a small nod, his face unreadable. For the next few weeks, Caleb found himself spending more time at Roger's house than he ever thought he would. It was strange at first, stepping inside the home where he had never felt welcome. The house was old, with dark wood paneling and faded photos hanging on the walls. Some of them were of Caleb's father and Roger when they were younger, back when they were just two brothers growing up in a small town. The first few days were mostly silence. Caleb drove Roger to doctor's appointments, picked up prescriptions, and helped him move around the house. Roger, stubborn as ever, refused to ask for anything outright. "You don't have to hover," Roger muttered one afternoon as Caleb helped him ease into his recliner. "Yeah, well, I don't want to be here longer than I have to, so let's just get this over with," Caleb shot back. For the most part, they kept their conversations short, sticking to topics that didn't involve the past. The weather. The football game on TV. The small repairs Roger needed around the house. But tension lingered in the air, heavy with everything they weren't saying. One evening, as Caleb was cleaning up the kitchen, he found an old, dust-covered box tucked away in the back of a cabinet. He opened it, expecting junk, but instead, he found letters. Dozens of them. Some were unopened, some crumpled at the edges, but they all had one thing in common. They were letters he had sent over the years. He held one up, his heart pounding. He had written to Roger once, when he was 20, after his father died, reaching out in a moment of grief. He never got a response. Now, seeing the envelope, still sealed, a wave of emotions crashed over him. "You kept them," Caleb said, stepping into the living room. Roger glanced up from his chair, eyes flicking to the letters in Caleb's hands. His expression darkened. "You had no right to go through my things," he muttered. Caleb scoffed. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize our relationship was built on boundaries and respect." Roger didn't respond. "Why did you keep them?" Caleb pressed, his voice softer now. "You didn't read them. You never wrote back. So why keep them?" Roger's fingers curled around the armrest. His breathing was slow, deliberate. "Because I didn't know how to let them go." Caleb stared at him, stunned into silence. Roger looked away, his jaw tight. "You think I don't regret things? You think I don't sit in this house and wonder if I should have done things differently?" He exhaled. "But you don't fix a broken bridge by pretending it was never burned." For the first time, Caleb saw something different in Roger. He wasn't just the man who had hurt him. He was an old man, a stubborn one, who had spent years trapped in his own pride, unable to admit he had been wrong. And maybe, just maybe, he was trying to change. The days went on, and something shifted between them. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy. But Roger started to let Caleb in small ways. He asked about Caleb's work, about his life in Chicago. He still didn't say the words "I'm sorry," but he started saying things like "I was wrong about some things and I don't know everything." One night, after a long day of appointments and home exercises, Roger sat on the porch, staring at the darkened sky. Caleb hesitated before stepping outside, leaning against the railing. "Do you ever think about what things would have been like if you hadn't pushed me away?" Caleb asked. Roger was quiet for a long time. Then, his voice came, rough but steady. "Every damn day." Caleb swallowed. "And—" Roger let out a slow breath. "And I wish I could take it back." For the first time, Caleb believed him. They weren't healed. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But for the first time in years, they weren't enemies anymore. And maybe that was a start. The night was quiet except for the rhythmic chirping of crickets outside Roger's house. Caleb sat at the kitchen table, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. The air between him and Roger had grown lighter over the past few weeks, but it still carried an unspoken weight, years of hurt, regret, and unfinished conversations. Roger shuffled in from the living room, leaning against the doorway, his frame still weak from recovery. His presence alone was an unspoken invitation, a silent challenge to the conversation they had been avoiding. "I heard from Pastor Jim today," Roger said, voice careful, testing the waters. "He asked about you." Caleb smirked. "Let me guess. How's the prodigal son?" Roger didn't answer right away. Instead, he walked over to the counter, gripping it for support. "I told him I was wrong about you," he said finally. "About a lot of things." Caleb blinked, caught off guard. Roger had never said it that plainly before. Roger exhaled and turned toward him. "There's something I need to ask you." Caleb straightened, bracing himself. "They're throwing a welcome-back dinner at the church this Sunday. Whole town's invited." Roger hesitated. "I want you to come." Caleb's stomach clenched. "To your church?" Roger nodded. "Yeah." A bitter laugh slipped past Caleb's lips. "Roger, do you hear yourself? Half the people in that room probably still think I'm a disgrace." Roger's face darkened, but not in anger, in shame. "You're right," he admitted. "But they need to see me standing next to you. They need to see that I was wrong." He looked Caleb straight in the eye. "And I need you to see it too." Caleb swallowed hard. He had spent years fighting for self-respect, for a place where he didn't have to prove himself to anyone. The idea of stepping back into a space where he had once been condemned felt like walking into a battlefield unarmed. "You're asking a lot from me," Caleb said, voice tight. "I know," Roger said. "But I'm asking anyway." The silence stretched between them. Caleb wanted to say no. He wanted to tell Roger that his fight for acceptance had ended years ago, that he had found his people, his life, his peace, without needing this town's approval. But this wasn't just about the town. This was about Roger. About the man who had spent so long standing on the wrong side, finally reaching across the divide. Caleb looked down at his hands, tracing the rim of his coffee cup. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I'll think about it." Roger gave a small nod, as if that was more than he had expected. But deep down, Caleb already knew his answer. He wasn't doing this for the town. He wasn't even doing it for Roger. He was doing it for himself. Sunday arrived faster than Caleb expected. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the sleeves of his button-down. His reflection stared back, unreadable. He had agreed to go, but part of him still wondered if he had made the right choice. The last time he had stepped inside Redwood Falls Community Church, he was 16. He had sat stiffly beside his parents as the pastor spoke about the sanctity of family. That afternoon, Roger had pulled him aside and told him, in no uncertain terms, that he was an embarrassment to the Mitchell name. Now, after everything, he was walking back into the same place. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Hannah, arms crossed, watching him carefully. "You sure about this?" she asked. "No," Caleb admitted. Hannah smirked. "At least you're honest." Then, her face softened. "I'll be right there with you, okay?" Caleb nodded, a lump forming in his throat. The church parking lot was already full when they arrived. Caleb hesitated at the entrance, his stomach twisting at the sight of familiar faces. Old neighbors, former teachers, men who used to shake his father's hand but had always looked right through him. Then, Roger stepped beside him. The old man wasn't leaning on his cane as much today. He looked steadier, stronger. And when he glanced at Caleb, it wasn't with resentment or hesitation. It was with something else. Conviction. Without a word, Roger took a step forward, moving through the crowd. Caleb followed. Inside, the murmurs began almost instantly. Caleb could feel the stares, the whispers. Some people looked surprised. Others looked uncomfortable. Then, Pastor Jim cleared his throat from the front of the room. "Welcome, everyone," he began, his voice carrying over the low chatter. "We have a special guest today." Caleb stiffened. He hadn't expected a public announcement. Roger spoke before Caleb could react. "I asked him to be here," he said, his voice firm, "because I want to say something." The room went still. Roger exhaled slowly, looking at the faces around him. "For a long time, I believed that love and family had conditions," he said. "That people had to fit a certain mold to be worthy of them." His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed forward. "And because of that belief, I turned my back on my own nephew. I shut him out when he needed me. I let my pride be more important than my family." A few gasps rippled through the crowd. Caleb swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. "I was wrong," Roger said, his voice stronger now. "I spent years convincing myself that I was right. That I was standing on the side of morality." He shook his head. "But morality without love is just cruelty dressed up in righteousness." Caleb's chest tightened. He had never expected this. Not in front of everyone. "I can't change the past," Roger continued. "But I can own it. And today, I want to say this, loud enough for everyone to hear." He turned, looking directly at Caleb. "I am proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not despite who you are. Because of who you are." A heavy silence followed. For the first time in a long time, Roger looked truly unburdened. He had let go of whatever had kept him trapped in his own hatred. Caleb didn't know how to respond. So he did the only thing that felt right. He reached out and gripped Roger's shoulder. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't forgiveness wrapped in a perfect bow. But it was something. A start. As the service ended, people hesitated before approaching Caleb. Some still kept their distance. Others, like an old teacher who used to pretend he didn't exist, patted him on the back and said, "Good to see you again, Caleb." It wasn't an apology. But it was an acknowledgement. And maybe that was enough. Outside, as the sun warmed the cool autumn air, Roger turned to Caleb. "Thank you," he said. Caleb studied him for a long moment. He could still feel the past lingering between them, the years of wounds that wouldn't heal overnight. But today, something had shifted. "You're welcome," Caleb said. Then, with a small smile, "But don't think this means I'm letting you off the hook that easy." Roger chuckled, shaking his head. "Wouldn't expect anything less." For the first time in years, they weren't on opposite sides of an invisible war. They were simply family. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A year later, Caleb found himself back in Redwood Falls, but this time, it wasn't out of obligation. He pulled into Roger's driveway, stepping out of the car just as the front door creaked open. Roger stood there, still a little slower than before, but healthier. Stronger. "You're late," Roger grumbled, but there was no bite to his words. Caleb smirked. Some things never change. He followed Roger inside, past the same old furniture, the same faded pictures on the walls. But something was different. The air felt lighter. The weight of the past wasn't so suffocating anymore. In the kitchen, Hannah was setting plates on the table, chatting with their mom. Caleb placed the homemade pie he had brought next to the roast. "Chicago treat?" Roger asked, eyeing it. "Homemade," Caleb corrected. "Don't get too excited." Dinner felt normal, something Caleb had never imagined would happen in this house. They laughed, talked about football, debated over which local diner had the best burgers. And then, near the end of the meal, Roger did something unexpected. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a stack of envelopes. Caleb's old letters. But this time, they weren't gathering dust. "I started reading them," Roger said quietly. "One at a time." Caleb didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. It wasn't about fixing everything. It wasn't about rewriting the past. It was about moving forward, together. And for the first time in years, Caleb knew he wasn't just tolerated. He was home.